All right. Welcome everyone to the How to Get a Job podcast. Today, we have an amazing episode in store because we are going to be talking about how to get a job from the recruiter's perspective. Really understand kind of like the hiring cycle. What is the role of the recruiter? What is the role of the hiring manager? How to really stand out and just understand how, putting ourselves in the other person's shoes that is looking at your application, looking at your resume to make that decision. Do we interview them? Do we not? Do we offer them? Do we not? So that you can stand out. And to talk about this important topic, I have two amazing guests. I have Christina and Ash. They're both the founders and career coaches at That Recruiter Method. Christina and Ash, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to be here.
I am excited to have this conversation. I love the fact that we can dive into some of the biggest questions that career coaches that we talk about getting a job, and that it's like understanding the recruiter side of it, right? We know recruiters are involved. We sometimes fear them and hate them when we're looking for jobs. And so I think it's wanted to kind of start out is, how did you guys get into recruiting? I don't know many people that when they're a kid, it's like, when I grow up, I want to be a recruiter. So how did you guys go to becoming recruiters and then now pivoting into saying, we're now supporting the job seekers and now starting the recruiter method?
Yeah. So my experience is much different than Christina's. I went to school, became a middle school teacher. I taught for quite a while and then needed more money. I was poor. And I was like, I can't survive on a teacher income by myself. And so I transitioned into the corporate sector. I bounced around. I think I'm on my 5th job transition now. So I'm a serial job hopper, typical millennial. But you're right. I did not even know what a recruiter was. I went and worked for the organization that recruited me to go into teaching. And they tapped on my shoulder and were like, hey, do you want to be a recruiter? And I was like, nope. And then they tapped enough times that I got into it and I ended up loving it. I just loved building the relationships, the experience. I made the switch over to tech very shortly after I got wanted some broader exposure beyond education, and quickly grew up in talent and have never looked back, and then met Christina along my journey.
Yeah. And so, a little different than Ashley. I did start, my education. So in college, I thought I was going to be a teacher, went to go get teaching jobs, and the economy wasn't doing very well. So a lot of my friends going into teaching at the time were getting pink slipped. So I kind of shift. I went to a staffing agency, got hired internally because I was bilingual and they needed somebody to, talk to people there. And so I started with the agency side of the house just for a little bit, and then moved over into corporate retail and then pretty much tech and university ever since. And then kind of back into in-house and biotech. And then Ashley and I had met throughout both of our careers. And I think I was telling you earlier, we focused on university recruitment, and that was a really fun way to be working together, working with students. And then now obviously more at the executive level, director level and above, tech, but mid-career and above is our sweet spot. But we both share a passion for talent acquisition and recruitment on the university side too, which is kind of neat.
So before we dive into kind of like recruiting, I would love for us to talk about what is the biggest difference between internal and external recruiting. So you had mentioned that you started in the agency side.
Yeah.
And so you guys both started, one in the agency side, one in direct, for the company side. Yeah. But I would tell you, most job seekers, specifically if they're starting out their career, don't know the difference between working when I'm dealing with an internal recruiter and an external recruiter.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Yeah. So basically, when you are working as a recruiter in-house, you're filling the job for the company. So when I was working at Illumina or at Google, right, I was directly hiring for that specific company. So candidates that would talk to me would be interviewing for a job directly at the company. I didn't make any extra money getting them to, get the job offer and take the job, right? So the in-house recruiter. When you're working for an agency, as a recruiter, you have to kind of find a client like an Illumina or like a Google or like a Meta to utilize your staffing services. And then once they say, yes, please fill these 10 jobs for me, we'll give you a 20% cut. I would then have to go recruit talent to then interview, go through the process, and then the company essentially hire that person. So sometimes I've actually been an employee on a contract and I've been, in-house recruiting. And so I would say the recruiters are very motivated to get you hired when they're at an agency because they're making commission off of filling you for the job. But either way, I think as a candidate, you want to be prepared for either, right? Whether it's an in-house recruiter or an agency recruiter, like being a prepared candidate is the most important thing.
So let me put in a theory, and I would love you guys disagree with me all you want. So totally good with it, right? I have found that when you're dealing with an agency recruiter and you have the first initial call with them, and you see that you match the qualifications that they're looking for, that an agency recruiter will try to do everything in their power to get you hired, to your point, right? Because they're trying to get the commission, right? So they will do interview prep for you. They will even redo your whole resume for you. Yeah. They will do everything they can to ultimately talk you up to the hiring manager. We'll send them an email and say, here's the highlights. Here's what you need to know, right? They're doing everything to say, you need to interview my person. And not only do you need to interview, you need to hire them. Like, they're perfect. But when you're working directly with let's say a recruiter is working for the company directly, they're not going to do that above and beyond. And it's not that they don't care as much, it's that they're obviously don't have a horse in the race. Whoever the hiring manager ends up hiring, it doesn't matter, because a recruiter from an agency, they might be one of 3 different agencies or more that are recruiting for this role. So their candidate is the only one they really care about. They might have 2 or 3 candidates interviewing.
Right.
So with that being said, how do you think a job seeker should be handling that relationship differently, knowing that one is more motivated than others to help you get the job?
I'm going to disagree on this
one,
actually. I'm going to disagree. I have worked in big tech, in a lot of tech spaces where recruiters are assessed based on their performance and their metrics, including things like candidate satisfaction scores, the number of offers that are extended per quarter, the number of offers that they get accepted, the expedience in which they are filling roles. And especially when I was at Meta, the candidate pool is so talented and the requirements for interviewing are really rigid. Like if I decline a candidate, they cannot re-interview for that same role for a specific amount of time. Mm-hmm. And so the recruiters that were on my team were incredibly motivated to get their candidates through because 1, they had metrics to hit. And then 2, they knew that if their candidate didn't make it through, that they would not be able to re-engage that candidate through the pipeline. And at big companies like Google and Meta, candidates are like owned by the recruiter. And so if that candidate gets dispositioned, they get released from your ownership. So then if they're owned by someone else, you can't re-engage that candidate.
There's rules of engagement. There's OKRs. Like, as recruiters at those big companies, it's actually very stressful.
Yeah, it can be really stressful.
You have to hit those metrics. You have to impress your hiring managers. You're getting lots of, feedback if it's not going well. So having I think what Ashley was saying, like disagreeing, is like having a horse in the race. It's like actually recruiters at those big FANG companies do a big one, right? It's their
No,
job.
This is great. Like, I'm glad you guys are disagreeing, because I would tell you the perception that like, from even my point of view, even my job seekers that I've worked with thousands, specifically from the college to career standpoint, is that when I am working with a Google recruiter or a Meta recruiter, directly recruiter from an agency, that I get ghosted, that I'm just a number. And so, like, obviously, like, I've never met a recruiter who didn't care about the people side. It's probably one of their favorite reasons why they're a recruiter in the first place. Like, no one's saying, like, but then you hear all these things of, like, I get ghosted pretty much 70+% of the time, and my recruiter is not replying to me, or X, Y, and Z. So you hear this thing. So then I would love to understand, like, why do you think the disconnect happens? Why do you think that there's this negative perception on the recruiters that they don't care, even though look at you guys care. You guys so defensive about the process, which is awesome, right? Because you obviously care. They're like, no, we care about our candidates. So where do you think that disconnection happens?
I think there's a couple spots. I think one, recruiters are people, and their stylistic preferences and there's communication preferences that go into play. I've led teams and entire departments in talent, and I know some prefer to pick up the phone, some prefer to send a text message, some prefer to send an email.
Yeah.
And if they get the job done, I'm going to let them do whatever feels the most comfortable and, make sure that they are creating an awesome candidate experience. But especially in the last couple of years, we're seeing an oversaturated market. Hundreds of thousands of people have been laid off in tech. And some of the biggest fat that's been trimmed are talent teams and HR professionals. And so, when I was leading a team at Meta, I was leading 3 teams at Meta, I had half of my team that was laid off in November, and then another chunk that were laid off in January. And I can imagine that some of the candidates we were working with felt like they were ghosted, but those recruiters were actually laid off. And those things were set up in such an expedient fashion by leadership that we didn't have a forwarding system set up. It wasn't thought through all the way until the end. And so I think teams are being cut. There are stylistic preferences that are at play. Some other things that happen is sometimes more senior people are being cut. You might have more junior people that are trying to figure out how to balance bandwidth and the number of clients that they have in the pipeline. And I think that's a skill.
Yeah. And those 2 things that Ashley hit on, like balance and bandwidth, right? So as you probably have noticed in the market, right, there's less jobs, there's more applicants, and then there's really thin talent teams at the moment. And so they're leveraging those automatic decline replies, right? Okay, well, we found our one person through an outside networking, or an email or a LinkedIn message or something, and they closed the rec, and those 300 people that applied didn't get reached out to, they didn't get contacted, they just got that automatic rejection email. And so and you're seeing that probably a lot on LinkedIn too. People are posting about that all the time. I got another rejection email. So I think it's that combination of like that balance and bandwidth. If the talent teams are so thin and there's less jobs and more recs per person, it gets tough.
No, look, and I totally understand that. I remember one thing that I can never forget, so I was in this management training program at PepsiCo, and I remember getting involved in campus recruiting, but I was recruiting at a non-core school. So there wasn't an HR recruiter attached to that school because it wasn't a core school. But because I was super involved in student organizations, and I said, hey, I'll take the lead. It was kind of like doing a favor to the HR person. I loved going back to UCF, which is where I went. I did so many, like, speaking of student organizations, info sessions and stuff like that school hired 8 out of the 20 management training programs for the region, which ultimately led to PepsiCo making that school a core school. And since I was already leading it and I had other relationships, I now essentially had the recruiter supporting me and saying, what do you need from me? I'll help you set up the interviews. Like I'll help you set up all, the filtering before you interview them. You shouldn't interview them before they take the assessment. That's going to help you filter candidates. So like they're over there helping me, supporting me in that sense. And I remember one thing that she told me that's really important. It's like, hey, Daniel, like, candidates know that they're not going to get 100% of the jobs they apply to. And I'm actually giving this advice to like people listening to this. I think it's important. It's like, you're not going to get, like, we know, like if I apply to 100 jobs, I'm not going to expect 100 offers.
Right.
And so they're realistic. They understand that they highly will get rejected. There's a high chance of them getting rejected, right? But they're going to always remember how you make them feel. And at working at PepsiCo, odds are they're going to consume our products very often, right? And so if we treat them bad, right? If we ghost them, if we treat them bad and they have a terrible candidate experience, then they're not only not going to use our products anymore, we're going to lose a customer. They're also going to tell at least 10 other friends and family members, and then they will use our product less. If so they have to choose between Gatorade and Powerade, they're going to choose Powerade, right? If they're going to have to choose between, 2 different chips, they're going to do that. And so it was like, it's super important that we humanize the process. And I do sometimes feel like that it's easy for job seekers to feel that the H and HR is gone, that because of all this now technology, and especially when you're dealing with technology companies that use more technology than the average company, right? And so I guess like would love to hear you guys' point of view. How common, like how is technology used in the hiring process? Like what's the applicant tracking system? Like, is it an evil robot algorithm that's just there to get you? Like, and what other things that you think candidates should know on how technology is being used to help the company make a decision, but also letting them know, hey, you're not the right fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think technology is hard. Like you said, taking the human out of the equation makes it really hard and less personal. I remember I would always call it, and this was coined by someone else I had worked with, but Heartbreak Friday. So basically every Friday, that's when I'd call and reject people. And it was always like just quick and to the point and letting them know. And I always wondered, do people even really appreciate this? And I think for the most part, they did. Right, that
Yeah.
that Heartbreak Friday, but at least it was over, and then I moved on to my offers. But technology wise, one thing I've experienced is, like an ATS like Workday, right? It actually started as a people software in HR that built this other arm to track applicants. So its main core function wasn't necessarily what it ended up doing. And yes, it had all these features, right? You can do knockout questions. You could filter by keyword searches, but it really depends on if the company wants to turn those features on.
Mhm.
And so when I was working at Illumina, we didn't use a lot of them. We did, at least for the roles that I was working on, maybe some roles did, but it really varied. So it's hard to know exactly what's going to work, but we know what doesn't work, right? So we were talking the other day about how, using like a Canva for your resume, it looks really beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily populate and translate well into a Workday system. So then you're going to find yourself entering in your jobs one by one. Whereas if you plugged in a Word document or a PDF, it would scrape it better. So there are certain things you can learn and tips and tricks, and we'll share those actually next week in our office hours. But you go ahead. I know you have some stuff to add.
I think the interesting thing is every candidate assumes that a company is using a typical ATS system.
Yep.
And Christina touched on this a little bit with Workday. It's actually technically an HRIS system. It's a human system for internal employees. And I've worked at companies that have used CRMs and converted them to ATS systems. And I've worked at companies that have used time management systems, like actual timesheet systems, and they've layered on an ATS system. And so the functionality is so different from company to company, and even what those are able to offer. And so like the most recent one that I had worked in, you couldn't keyword search, like you couldn't even pull reports on it. And I was only able to do keyword searches in a handful of ATS systems that I did. And I've only worked in one that has auto-populated rejection questions. But typically when you're working with knockout questions, which is what Christina mentioned, there's a few of them and they're dependent on what the candidate enters in. And so they're not going to like read your resume and say like, oh, these don't apply to these job specific questions, you're getting auto rejected. It's like, did you enter the question as it was needed? Like, do you meet the years of requirement? Do you have enough like SaaS like experience? And if you don't answer them according to those requirements, you are going to get an auto rejection. But most companies, the only one I can think of that I know that uses a blotting system is the US government website. They actually have a built-in blotter.
There you go.
So I think it's interesting because you hear so many job candidates try to ask, like they always like, well, ask me is like, how do like, what's the hack for the ATS? How do I do I copy the job description, put it like, should I copy the job description? She's like, what about if I copy the job description, put it on the resume in like white font, really, really small,
margin,
so that you can't see it, but then it like when you scrape it, it will find it, so it has all the matching. Yeah. And I always say like, trying to like hack the applicant tracking system is like trying to cheat for a test in college. Like if you just instead of just studying and getting it done, it'd be way easier than try to do it, because not only is there hundreds of different ATS companies, right?
Right.
A lot of those ATS can be changed by department, by manager, by recruiter. And so by the time someone gets it, there's so many variations of it that you're never going to really know. And I always just say like, just answer honestly, because that's going to give you the best results at the end of the day. And I think it's important to address. So I work with a lot of international students, and they get way more rejections than your traditional, somebody with work authorization, citizen, resident, or so on. And they're like, should I lie on the question where it says, do you now or in the future require sponsorship? And because they say, when I say no, I always get interviews. And if I say yes, if I'm honest that I require sponsorship, I always get automatic rejection. So and I'll give you guys what I give them. I will, again, disagree with me. I always say, hey, you should be honest, because it doesn't buy you anything by lying. It might get you an interview, but in the interview, they're going to ask you for more information, then you're going to be rejected. And I always tell them, like, if anything, is saving you time, because if you're getting knocked out by that question, it's because they can't sponsor you. So why even be in this false hope that you're in the process with Google or Meta or X company versus you spending your limited time that you have on companies that could and are willing to sponsor you? And I think that's it's hard for them to swallow, because it's like they know that if they lie, that they would get further in the process. But I'm like, but you don't get the job. And what's super exciting, I'll share this story really quick. I just had a mentee who disregarded my advice, right? Got the job offer. It was with a healthcare company. I don't know how this happened either. So if you guys have insights on, so they got the job. This individual moved cities, signed a 12-month lease, was working for the company for a week or so, got called into HR and said, hey, maybe we missed your paperwork. And then the guy came clean, and then they're like, hey, we have to terminate you. Like, we can't sponsor for this role. Like, we asked for that in the application. And so now this person is stuck. He just spent a couple of $1,000s moving. He signed a 12-month lease to an apartment and has no job and has like less than 60 days to get a job. And I use that as like, that's like the worst case scenario. This is exactly why you don't want to lie in that, because even if you get the job, what do you do now? You could only blame yourself in that scenario.
Yeah.
Right. What not to do, right?
Yeah. Really unfortunate. Because I think a lot of candidates don't realize that recruiters are really limited to what they can ask, just state legality. And we're in California. And so I would say by default, recruiting, we just apply the very rigid California laws to all of the states that we work with. And so one of the things we cannot ask a candidate is if they're a US citizen, a permanent resident, or if they have citizenship status. And so because it could put a level of discrimination into the job search. And so, it can very easily get missed, and a candidate can get all the way to the offer stages. And then typically you're not collecting, like social security number or anything until that first week of work during onboarding. Yeah. So it gives this very unfortunate false sense of hope. And then especially in the instance where companies have government contracts, there's no way to work around that.
Yeah.
There's just no opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about telling people to put in the time in the actual, like the story and the companies that are going to invest in, like you said, the work authorization, that makes a lot more sense. And I think like that's where coaching comes into play, right? We can help get them super prepared, get their story, get their experience, get in front of those companies that are going to invest in them landing their job, their dream job, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. So let me ask you guys a question now. So let's say, let's start from the beginning of like that application all the way kind of going down. What advice do you have in candidates getting visibility? Now, especially if they're applying to these really competitive companies where it's not just them versus 100 other candidates, it's them against thousands, right? Mm-hmm. So like, what are some advice on getting their application more visibility so that a recruiter or the hiring manager is spending more than like the average 7 seconds a recruiter is spending to review a resume?
I think making your resume really clean, memorable, impactful, diving into what's going on the resume, I think is really important. I will say I've had some pretty standout resumes that, this was 10 years ago. It probably wouldn't make it through an ATS now, but I did one time, a long time ago, receive it was basically a video game resume. So you opened the file and it was like Mario, and he went through his experience, and then he like got a gold star, and then he graduated. And then, it was so clever and so creative. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I still remember that resume of the thousands that I've seen and redone, right? So you can do a really memorable thing like that. I don't know that he, or where that person is. And I do remember that resume, and that is a way to stand out, but I don't think that's realistic for most candidates. And so figuring out how to make yourself stand out, right? So maybe including that in a hobby, like I am a Super Mario Brother aficionado or whatever it is okay, because that's going to resonate with people. But you kind of have to have the experience to back it up. You have to have really good formatting. You have to have the details that you're going to need to stand out with the resume, and just making sure you're applying to the right jobs too. Like what level, what role, who do you know there? How can you get in?
Yeah, I think another thing too is when you start getting into like Fang and Meng companies, I don't think a lot of people realize most of the candidates that my team hired, at least, we sourced. We had a ton of inbound applications. We got so many that were not qualified. And we had a separate team that would review the resumes, but my recruiters and sourcers were actively sourcing for candidates.
Yeah.
And so being on LinkedIn is huge, and making sure that your LinkedIn is very reflective of your resume. Because if I need somebody who has 20 years of Salesforce experience, basically from the time that Salesforce started, like I'm not going to waste my time reaching out to people who maybe look like they've only touched Salesforce.
Yeah.
And so you really want to have, I think, a robust LinkedIn. A LinkedIn presence is always very helpful. Sometimes, recruiters are reaching out to hundreds of candidates, just trying to get those 20 responses back to take them through the funnel. And it's really hard to create a tailored outreach as a sourcer or as a recruiter if you see that somebody's not really active on LinkedIn. Like they haven't posted in 6 months. You don't even know if they've logged into the account. They don't have a lot of experience on there.
Right.
So I think it's just really important to have a standout LinkedIn. And then, there's always networking, but what we like to tell our clients by the time they've come to us, it's like, if you haven't already been networking or you don't have a new network to cultivate, you're networking for tomorrow.
Right.
So you need a strategy for today, because it's unrealistic to go in and say, hey, can I have coffee with you? By the way, can you give me a referral? By the time you have that coffee, there's already candidates in interview stages for that job.
That's true.
That's so interesting. You're saying it's because if I understand correctly, you can have hundreds of applications, but your team might also be outsourcing new candidates, right? And so I would love to maybe understand the different ways that a recruiting team can get candidates. So I think if I understand from my side, there's a couple of them. Like you have referrals, you have inbound applications, you have outsourced, so you have your recruiters are sourcing, and then you have agencies. Do you try to, when you're a recruiter manager, do you prioritize one or the other? Is there okay, let's go through referrals first. Let's see internal candidates. Let's then try to source them ourselves. And if not, let's hire an agency and pay the fee, but they have a pipeline of candidates. How do you guys think through that?
Well, something that Ashley was mentioning about the sourcing, just something to kind of bring up and give you perspective. Some talent teams are so large, right? Like the Metas and the Googles, they have literally resume reviewers where that recruiter function's job is just to review resumes. They have sourcers. I've been a sourcer. My whole job was to live on LinkedIn, reach out. I owned candidates. They were tracked like leads in Salesforce. I mean, it was very competitive, and it was within a specific parameter. Software engineer, Mountain View with 2+ years of experience, very strict parameters. I wasn't looking at resumes ever. I was only looking at LinkedIn's doing that job, right? And then they would be fed to the recruiter. And then the recruiter would manage that source candidate from there. And so then there's recruiters, and then they're also using agencies for all of those things. So like you said, those 5 different ways of getting candidates, you want to be prepared holistically, because you can go into one of those big companies one of 5 different ways, right?
Yeah. And you asked which one was more important, like what is prioritized. And unfortunately, I think the answer to that is it depends on the company.
Yeah.
And so some companies will prioritize referrals, especially if they come from leadership. And then they, might have another process. But, a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, a referral is helpful in ensuring that you get reviewed, but it doesn't priority in an interview by any means. And typically when you're interviewing at a bigger company, or even a lot of mid-sized companies now, they actually try to not include that you're a referral going into the interview process.
The biases?
To mitigate bias.
Yeah.
And so a referral is helpful to get you that resume review, but it's not necessarily going to land you the job. You still have to be the most qualified candidate. And then some companies who are big on events, like you asked a creative outside of the box. Events. I love meeting people at events. If I can put a name to the face and I feel more personally invested, I'm going to follow through with that person until the end. And like in university recruiting spaces, we prioritized closing out our candidates from events before anything else because they had that personal engagement. And it goes back to what you said at PepsiCo. You want to make sure that the brand is being upheld. And if I'm going to an event, my brand is on the line at that event or conference that I just went to.
Absolutely. So let's say we applied, we get to the first round of interviews, and it's generally like a screening interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like generally with a recruiter or a sourcer or somebody in the recruiting team, right? At this point, what advice do you have for a job seeker to then be able to build a stronger relationship with the recruiter so that they can then help them prepare for the next round? Like, is there like, do you see that if a candidate were to be like, hey, Christina, hey, Ash, I'm so glad that you think I'll be a good fit for the next round. Can I ask you guys for advice? Or do you think that's taboo? Like, where should you not cross the line, or where should you cross the line? Or how do you build that relationship even stronger?
I think when you're an early candidate, a lot of it is building rapport. Small talk matters. And so I always tell people, get good at small talk. A lot of us don't like it, but it is important. And I think that give and take it is great. Some of my most memorable candidates, I knew about their boyfriends, their parents, their dad's surgery, their move to another state. And it just felt like this is the people-y side of recruiters. We like the people, we like investing in them, and we want to feel like we're being invested back in. And so I do think the small talk part matters. And I think it's fine to ask, what are next steps? Or do you have concerns about my candidacy? Or can you tell me when I'm going to hear back? I really love when candidates set up those expectations. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about the process and when I might hear back from you? Because it is basically a verbal agreement of like, if I don't hear back from you, then I can follow up with you on this date. And so it's getting that two-way buy-in. Where I think candidates may cross the line is where they say, can you tell me what would make me more competitive for this role? Or do you think that, just asking about like other candidates' qualifications. And I have had some candidates do that. Like, are there any other candidates who have this? And it's like, I can't tell you about the other candidate experience. Yeah. So I think that tends to be like, don't veer over that line.
No,
so I think just really quick, jumping into that, the small talk is so important, and just finding something that's a little bit memorable about you, fun fact or whatever it is, right? Your pitch when you're introducing yourself, hey, tell me about yourself, just having that really dialed in and ready to go. And that's where you can include that something quirky or that something memorable. Hi, I'm Christina and I love puzzles. Let me tell you why I'm the perfect fit for this job, right? And all of a sudden you're tying it in and they're going to be like, puzzle girl. Okay.
Yep. And they would write it just like that too. Puzzle girl.
Puzzle girl.
Yeah.
And 1 of 10 people they're screening, and we all pretty much will do the exact same thing. And so what's going to make you stand out during that recruiter phone screen? And what can they associate you to? I think those are key things too.
We have a client who was on a 15-year Rubik's Cube journey, and it very much fits into the role that he was applying to. Like the reason that he did it and how it applies to the role, it works. But when he told us this, I was like, wait, why were you on a 15-year like Rubik's Cube journey? And like, tell me about this.
You can YouTube this. Yeah. It's like, no, I need to know I can do it on my own.
And I need to document the process so that I can replicate it. And so it was just like finding those things where you're just like, okay, I need to know more about this, but also like, hey, I'm telling you about my thought process, my commitment, like how I document things. I'm talking to you about physics. I'm talking to you about math. I'm like, oh, dang, 15-year Rubik's Cube guy. Like,
yeah. Yep. That's so funny. Last thing before we wrap it up and ask you guys about kind of like how you guys work with candidates. So what's your, like, a lot of candidates are upset because they don't get feedback. But I would love to hear from you guys. Why do recruiters tend to not give feedback? Because obviously candidates are like, I just want to improve. All I want to do is get better.
That's why we went into coaching, Daniel. You're not really supposed to give any feedback.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
can you explain maybe why? So the job seekers don't think that the recruiters are evil and it's like, they don't care about me. They don't want, like, there's reasons behind you guys not giving feedback. It's not that you guys don't care. That's not the reason.
Right.
Most of the time.
This kind of ties back to the beginning when we were talking about agency versus in-house. I found that a lot of agency recruiters are actually more open to giving feedback because they might re-engage those candidates with a different company. Whereas when you're in-house, you're an employee of that company, and therefore any actions that you take become a liability to that company. And so, for example, if I were to say, hey, we're not moving forward with your candidacy because like your Python, like coding exercise, blah, blah, blah. And then we hire somebody else who maybe was on the equal level of Python, but just had like that one something that was just a leg up. Then we have dispositioned somebody for the same reason that we hired somebody else, from an external perspective. And that becomes a lawsuit.
And so, it's the legality behind it, right? Like companies don't want to have recruiters, right? They're humans, can't control everything that comes out of their mouth. And if something is said in a way that's not correct, and it can be discriminatory or what have you, right? It puts the company and the individual at risk. And so that's why I think recruiters are really hesitant to give any feedback.
And feedback is also a skill. Not everybody's good at giving it. And so I think naturally some folks will just shy away from it, but then others might give you feedback that is well-meaning, but sounds horrible. And then again, bigger liability. So
people want feedback, but I think receiving it and accepting it and knowing how to utilize it and apply it is also a skill.
I was the recruiter who made the mistake. Well, I wouldn't even say a mistake. I was the recruiter who gave feedback. I was like, this is a gift, whether you accept it or not, here you go. But she's right. Like I've had people argue with me and I'm like, I'm not the hiring decision maker. I'm just relaying the information that I was told so that you can be better. Like this is a job that I think you're better at. But there's so many elements. Just know that recruiters, for the most part, we want to give feedback. We want you to do better. We want to re-engage you because we've already invested time in you.
It makes our lives easier, right?
It makes our lives easier. But especially when you're in-house, you just can't.
Yeah. It is definitely like the liability reason behind it. And I think like candidates just know like it's not because they don't want to help. And so I appreciate you guys sharing that and saying that you guys care. So like just to follow up on this, how do you guys feel about a candidate that says, hey, Ash and Christina, thank you so much for, I totally understand you guys have decided to go with somebody else. Is there any other role within the organization that you think I'll be a better fit for? Like, is that okay? Or is that like also taboo? No.
Love that question.
I always call it finding someone a home. I love to find qualified people homes. I think that's a power skill of mine when I was heavy in recruiting. It's you're actually not right for this role. Let me see if I can move you to a different team and then get hired that way.
Yeah. I think it's like for us, we always tell all of our candidates to do that. It's like a rejection is a no today doesn't mean tomorrow. They're just saying no today for this role for this particular time. And you don't know what could happen with this role. Maybe that person that they hire fails the background check and you were the second person and they're now like, hey, you still in the market. But before we wrap it up, by the way, I don't know if you guys, I'm looking over here a lot. It's because we actually had a lot of people on the live. There's still 100 people on LinkedIn actively watching this right now, which is pretty cool. There is one question I want to shout out from Robert. Is interested in your thoughts on video-based resumes.
Oh, so I don't know if he's asking about a video-based resume as in you are communicating that to the company or if it's like a one-way interview. I strongly dislike one-way interviews. It is like my
higher view kind of thing.
Okay.
Oh, higher view.
So
I think Robert. So just knowing Robert, I think he's saying about candidates recording themselves, kind of like, "Hey, I'm Daniel," and like you've seen like some of the TikToks that have gone viral where they're applying for TikTok.
I do think they help people to stand out.
Yes.
But where they are a norm in the company, I actually personally don't agree with that, because I do think that that is not an inclusive hiring practice. I think it can integrate a lot of bias into the interviewing process. It's not inclusive for people who just don't have that communication style preference, neurodivergence. And so I personally am not a fan of them. I did get a chance to go to a conference a couple years ago where they were talking about the process in which video resumes go through. So they go through like an initial screening process by a recruiter, and then the recruiter kind of selects forward and then moves some candidates forward, and then they engage in the phone screening process. But for me, and what I tell my clients is, the interviewing process is also an opportunity for you to interview the company that you're going to work with.
Yeah.
And do you feel comfortable and feel like you would love this job or company enough that you have no initial questions up front? And if the answer is yes, like this is my dream job and company, then I would go for it. But time is our biggest asset. It's our most valuable asset. It's finite. We don't get a lot of it. And so I like to recommend my candidates and my clients to protect their time. And if it doesn't feel good, don't do it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So before we wrap it up, I would love to hear more about the recruiting method, how you guys work with candidates. If people are listening and watching this, whether it's a podcast or on LinkedIn, how can they connect with you? By the way, if you are watching this on LinkedIn, I have tagged both Ash and Christina on the comments. So if you can click on them, follow them, connect with them. But ladies, you guys can take it away.
Yeah. So our website is actually down. It's being rebuilt today. So
LinkedIn, that's your new website.
On LinkedIn, have an Instagram.
Yeah. We have a contact at therecruitermethod.com. So you can email contact@therecruitermethod.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, just Ash Gosselin, and there's a booking link if you want to chat with us. Christina also has a booking link on hers. It's Christina Hepburn.
Yep.
And then our website, when it powers back up, is just therecruitermethod.com.
Yeah. And I think too, just like, what we talked about today, when you asked us that feedback question, that's why we're doing what we're doing now, right? We want to be that recruiter in your back pocket. We want to give you the feedback on your resume, your LinkedIn, your interviewing skills, kind of help you navigate that career journey so you get to the offer process.
Yeah.
That's why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah. We've worked with hiring managers, executive leaders, directors, like all of the hiring managers at every level from within the technical industry. And so I think that's what makes us a little bit unique, is like we have invested in hundreds of hiring managers and tens of thousands of hours of time working with thousands of candidates. Yeah. And so
that's where that competitive edge will come from.
We just know what they want. Like we know what they want. We've heard it time and time again. And so we are actually doing a career power hour on the 24th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to be doing a live demo of how I and Christina, how we rewrite technical resumes and kind of go through our best practices. But there's also an opportunity for open Q&A at the end. So if anyone wants to ask questions about interviews or video applications, you're more than welcome to join. Yeah. You can sign up via the Google form on our most recent post, because again, our website is down.
But we're giving away 5 resume reviews. So the people that join, we're going to be doing a little giveaway so people can get their resumes reviewed.
Amazing. So you guys heard it. We'll put all that information, if you're listening to the podcast, on the show notes. Their LinkedIn's will be there. Their website will be there. If you're watching this on LinkedIn, then I've tagged them on the comments. Go ahead, and then I can take them to their LinkedIn page, and then you guys can then connect. Christina, Ash, thank you so much for being here. For all of you that are listening, if you haven't already liked and subscribed to the podcast, what are you waiting for? Thank you so much for listening, and catch you guys on the next episode.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.